Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. You can probably notice already, but the main event of this video and what has happened over the past 24 hours is the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. I previously mentioned about this offensive in my video where I pretty much called it a massive PR failure because it's just another one of these PR strikes near the border area, and I will admit I misjudged the situation completely because this is not just another PR event, it is a genuine offensive operation. The Ukrainians have managed to capture about 50 square kilometers of Russian territory in the Kursk region. They have fought over the villages of Nikolaevka Derino, Nizhny Klin, Verdlikovo, as well as moving onwards in the northern direction along the road. At the same time, the Ukrainians launched an assault here by Oleshnia, Gogolivka, and towards Rubanshina, all of this in the direction of Sutsha. We see that the Ukrainians have managed to advance to the outskirts of the town and capture a part here to the north. What we see is that the Ukrainians initially launched an assault with about 300 soldiers and a few dozen vehicles, including tanks and other armored vehicles, which was a large battle that took place really here in the region, but they ended up being forced back. They took some Russian border guards as prisoners and then went back to the border area. But that is when the real battle began, because following this assault, the Ukrainians sent additional units across. At the start, it was reported that at most one brigade was in the border area, but starting at the same time as this first assault took place, additional units started swarming into the area here near the border. The Russians did deep strikes into Ukrainian territory, but that is when the Ukrainian air defense revealed itself. The Ukrainians had prepared a large concentration of air defense here in the north as well to cover for this offensive operation. In this way, the Ukrainians actually managed to shoot down a Ka-52 helicopter here in the border area and has limited the capabilities of the Russian Air Force in the area. So we see that the Ukrainians actually created a well-prepared and well-thought-out offensive operation in this area. This operation is most reminiscent of the Kharkiv offensive rather than the border raids or anything else the Ukrainians have done. And this is better prepared than the Ukrainian summer offensive. So we see that the Ukrainians have actually learned a lot from the developments we have seen throughout the 2 years of the conflict so far. So what is the current situation? The current situation is that some of these villages are captured, others are surrounded as the Ukrainians went quickly through them with the first advanced units. The real battle is taking place in these morning hours. The Ukrainians have gathered a lot of troops in the border area. The Russians are constantly bombarding them, but the Ukrainians are bombarding the Russians back across the border because they've received permission to strike across the border. So we see that the Ukrainians and the Russians are doing long-range strikes against each other. The Russian Air Force is limited by the Ukrainian air defense. Similarly, we've not seen any activity of the Ukrainian Air Force either, so they are also limited by the Russian air defense. So we see that the Russians are still able to make use of their Air Force, especially with the FAB bombs, but we may see the involvement of either F-16 or other Patriot systems near the border area if they wish to continue developing this offensive operation. The result of the offensive operation is that they have managed to cross deep into Russian territory to the first defensive position of the Russians. The Russians, unlike the Ukrainians, were not in a position where, for example, here in the Kharkiv-Belgorod direction, the city itself is very close to the front, and it was expected that the Russians would launch offensive operations in the north. Therefore, the Ukrainians built fortified positions from the recapture of the Kharkiv region until today. Comparatively, the Russians have built some fortified positions, but they are a bit further from the front, sort of like a gray zone where the only activity of the Russians on the Russian side of the border really was border guards, and the first few villages were evacuated. Therefore, we see that the fortified positions along the front line were focused here in the north, and beyond the first village is the gray zone towards Sucha. So we see that the Ukrainians have captured the fortified positions of the Russians in the north and have pushed into beyond these fortified positions into Russian territory, where they've actually reached the outskirts to the next line of defense here in the northern parts, and looks like they have breached it. I'm not really sure what sort of defensive positions are here. It could be a trench, could be some sort of dragon teeth, just to slow down any Ukrainian offensive operation until the Russians are able to concentrate their forces in the areas. Similarly, here by Sucha, it is a conglomeration of multiple villages and towns in the area, which means that the Ukrainians, if they start fighting here, it could end up being another part where it's a lot of urban fighting. Depends on how long it takes for the Russians to send their forces to the area. We see that there is a railway going through the eastern parts. This means that this is pretty much Vovchansk of the northern parts of the Russian side of the border. So we are going to be seeing a Kharkiv-style offensive by the Ukrainians here in the north if things continue as is developing right now, with the Ukrainians sending additional forces across the border, sending their air defense into the area, sending generally what we've seen is not the RDK or something similar as we saw with previous border raids. Instead, we see actual Ukrainian forces with their actual modern equipment and everything they have available. We, for example, have this image here of the American M1132 Striker ESV with LWMR mine roller. So they have mine clearing equipment on modern IFVs. We also have this video here or footage here where we see a civilian driving through the Kursk area, where he then sees the Russian Air Force flying overhead and smoke rising from a strike that happened nearby. So we see that there's active activity of the Russian Air Force very close to the border area. We also have this image here of a Russian delivery of tanks to the border area to partake in the operations, the defensive operations against the Ukrainian offensive, where two Russian trucks and their tanks that were on top on the back of the trucks were destroyed. This means that the Russians did not even have time to get into position during this offensive operation, as the Ukrainians did some of these deep strikes. They had a lot of FPV drones and reconnaissance drones available to partake in this operation, which has allowed them to get an overview of the situation, know where the Russian forces are, and strike them while they are deploying, similar to when the Russians did the Kharkiv offensive. Therefore, I can conclude based on the developments that this is really just the Ukrainian version of the Kharkiv offensive. They saw what the Russians did and they wanted to imitate it, and they are so far succeeding at the same level that the Russians were succeeding in the Kharkiv offensive. This means that there are three possibilities for the objective of the Ukrainians. Number one would be to force the Russians to withdraw from the Belgorod region away from the Kharkiv offensive to deal with the Ukrainian Kursk offensive and thereby neutralize any offensive operations across the border area. That is the first possibility. The second possibility is that they want the Russians to redirect forces from the east to the Kursk region. This is to prevent the Russians from taking advantage of their current success and momentum in the east, where they are on a day-to-day basis advancing through the Avdiivka-Pokrovsk section at the front line, almost completely captured New York, and are infiltrating Turets these days with the ongoing offensive operations and storming of Jessev Yar ongoing. So they want to stop the Russian momentum and redirect their forces to the Kursk region. That is the second objective. The third objective would be to gain some territory in the Kursk region and actually hold it so that they have some sort of advantage when it comes to peace negotiations. Zelensky has been talking about these peace negotiations for a while now, whether they should give out territory or not, making a referendum, all of this stuff. This points towards the Ukrainians being willing to negotiate for peace soon, and this is something that could point in that direction. That is something that could make the playing field more even when it comes to negotiations. Therefore, the objective could be either of these three or all three at the same time. The more the merrier, as they say. So the Ukrainians are here looking to divert Russian resources. However, there is still one issue, and that is that the Russians do have a lot of forces in reserve as well. This means that they will start using that before they redirect forces from other areas. They could limit offensive operations to prevent the Russian forces from being spread thinly, but I do not believe this will have any impact in the Turetsk, Jesevyar, and Pokrovsk offensive operations. I believe the Russians will continue as was planned, but I do believe that it could affect other areas like the Kharkiv region or remove some forces from the Kupiansk or Zaporizhia sections of the front line. This again, the Ukrainians, depending on the strength of their push, it could just be a few brigades, it could be the entire reserve. We do not know anything right now, as there's hardly any information at all from either side. A lot of people are saying a lot of stuff right now, but no one saw this coming in details. No one saw a concentration of Ukrainian forces because they really did not concentrate forces until it had already begun. Compared to the Kharkiv offensive, I reported about a concentration of Ukrainian forces already a week prior to it happening, where the Ukrainians had gathered hundreds of PT-91 tanks received from Poland and other heavy equipment prior to the Kharkiv offensive of the Ukrainians, the Kharkiv counter-offensive. This time we had no such report anywhere. The Ukrainians managed to safely hide and avoid detection, at the very least to our information publicly stated, and therefore it was very difficult to actually see this coming and the scale of it and so on. So again, I was hasty in my previous video saying that it was similar to the previous border raids. This is completely different, and this could be an actual offensive. Again, we do not know the details yet. We are still in the very early stage of this operation. This could just be a diversion, but it could also be a genuine offensive. And that is the current situation and the current knowledge we have available. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.